That was the challenge. Like, oh my God, we don't want to embarrass Sony.
I don't think you could underestimate the influence on the brand of Wipeout. That fed a lot of what made the initial launch of PlayStation so cool. Without Psygnosis, it would be very difficult to see how PlayStation would have understood the market for video games correctly.
I was under no illusion that we were going to crush Sega.
Hello and welcome to the Game Business Show with me, Christopher Dring. We are celebrating the 30th anniversary of PlayStation in Europe, and we're here at an unofficial party to celebrate that, and we have some proper PlayStation legends here today, people that launched the PS1 in Europe, including the likes of Chris Deering and Jim Ryan. We're going to be speaking to as many of them as we can to find out their own experiences of launching that first PlayStation machine. If you are a paid subscriber to the Game Business, we have an extended version of this video, so please do watch the extended version if you want to hear all the unedited interviews. If not, enjoy what we have here for you today. I'm joined by PlayStation royalty in the form of Chris Deering, who ran PlayStation Europe at the launch of PS1. How you doing anyway?
I'm doing fine, thanks.
Now, Chris, I know you were part of the Sony empire already when PlayStation came calling, but although you'd worked in Europe in the past in other roles and you worked with European retailers, you weren't actually in Europe at the time, were you?
It became evident that there was something cooking in the game space. And I'd done a little bit of distribution for Nintendo and Sega cartridges as part of a distributed line for the video company, RCA Columbia International Video. So Sony said, hey, would you like to get involved in PlayStation? And I said, yeah, that sounds great to me. And they said, oh, that's good because you could live, I was working in LA at that time. They had moved us to there. We were over to Santa Monica. I said, well, what about Europe? They said, well, Europe's small by comparison to the U.S. And I said, yeah, but I mean, I can do the U.S., but really, I don't think there's any other people could do Europe better than I, because I know how to get product into retailers in Europe. I think that Nintendo and Sega have been using distributors who played games with each other, against each other, cross-shipping, and didn't have a, consistent marketing, marketing strategy, communication strategy. So anyway, they said, well, okay. And I said, I tell you what, I think we can be as big as the U.S.
Oh, wow.
And so I said, if we're not as big as the U.S. in 5 years, then you can make a decision after that. But I know, of course, I didn't know we'd even be here for 5 years because we hadn't launched yet.
But PlayStation was the new kids on the block, right? You mentioned Sega and Nintendo. They were the established powers in the water.
Yeah.
So what did you see as the biggest challenges, the biggest obstacles to getting it established?
Well, I saw it as an opportunity. Of course, we didn't know if the market was big enough for all three, but the market had been, even in the U.S., the Nintendo had a big initial run, and then Sega came along with the Master System and Mega Drive. And so the market was not totally unified. There were big players, but there was space. Technically, there was space. And I felt that Sony would a lot of credibility to the concept of a console in Europe, because in Germany in particular, consoles had a bad image. They were seen as bringing those arcade machines from the funny places down by the train station. In the home, and the parents were really quite concerned about not letting other parents see a game machine under their TV.
Yeah.
So that's why, for example, Game Boy went so big in Germany. And you got a similar kind of thing was happening in Korea, too, Anyway, I thought Sony would help overcome that barrier to expansion. I also felt that the positioning of the game machines, especially Sega, was mostly, sort of rock and roll, pirate radio, not for everybody, and probably not for the smaller kids. And so I felt that Sony would make the console legitimate for smaller kids and for product categories that weren't just driving, shooting, and arcade type games. So I thought that was going to be an opportunity. The challenge was really to I would say muscle in, but come in as a new refreshing way to think about consoles. And we didn't know how the console would be received. we know that the first year did very well in Japan, but that was Japan, you know. So there was some uncertainty, and try to predict how it would go and how fast it would grow and how many units would be sold and what the ratio of software to hardware would be. And I think the first plan over the 3 years was over 3 years we were going to do maybe, I think, 3 million units of hardware and maybe 14 million units of software. And I said, wow, seemed like a lot when you're not selling any, you know. So that was the challenge. Like, oh my God, we don't want to embarrass Sony, and we don't want to, you know, disrupt the market in an unfavorable way. But it was mostly just get on with it. You know, luckily I had some contacts in the countries around, not just the UK, France, and Germany. So I had people I could call right away. Mm-hmm. There were people in the company from Sony Electronic Publishing, and which was, you know, sort of run under Psygnosis. Mm-hmm. And that was a big advantage to having that, let's say, relationship with how to manage the relationship with developers, mm-hmm. and manage the relationship with licensed product or second-party product or even third-party product in a way. And so it was a small but mighty team, and it was just around the corner down here in number 13 Great Marlborough Street. And it was, we had about 9 months, you know, when we started. The original planned launch date was September 9, to go out the same day as the U.S.
Yeah.
And we got down to the final wire. There was understandable little snags in terms of the PAL system, because we were a different chip. And some of the games were a little bit late, and we were just setting up all the distribution in all these countries, and it wasn't just one country like the U.S. market. So we ended up delaying it for 20 days, but I mean, that wasn't really too bad considering we instead of the 20th or the 9th, we went to the 29th.
Yeah.
And I remember it like it was yesterday, you know, and we went down on Kingsley Street to a little place called the Two Floors, which I think is still there. It was until about a month ago. And we had a little celebration, and it wasn't a big, you know, a big blast of a party. It was like, well, it really got out, you know. And then we had some parties after that. But I mean, that was, you asked, how did it start? That's how it started.
Some of the marketing, at least in the UK, was quite edgy at the time. Did that go down well with Japan? I always got a different impression of Sony at that point.
I knew about it, you know. It was a pirate radio, you know, and the U.S. had a very edgy positioning. I wasn't afraid to be adventuresome. I wasn't afraid to be challenging, but I didn't want it to look like it to parents like it was not for all ages, and it was not for the girls and as well as the boys. So I wouldn't say we deliberately stayed away from that edgy positioning. We had some edgy kind of ads, but the brief we gave to Simons Palmer, which was the ad agency at the time, is to make it aspirational or, you know, almost seductive, you know, and they came up with this.
It was cool, I think.
Yeah, it was a place, not the anti-place, it's Society Against PlayStation, SAP. And they were basing the whole positioning on this movie back in the 50s or 60s called Reefer Madness. And it was trying to tell the kids that they were telling the parents that it was like a drug, and it was going to twist their mind and they were going to be addicted. But it was all done in a lighthearted way. Yeah. And it had the Sony name. And we went out with a game called Mickey's Wild Adventure with Mickey Mouse, and it had a little movie at the beginning of it. Yeah. From the original Steamboat Willie, and it just had kind of a retro feel for that for the parents. And so from the beginning, there were products for the Nintendo kids.
Yeah, yeah. Why do you think PS1 won over Europe? Because it still is, PlayStation's still king in Europe. What was it about that and what you did that won over the market?
Well, I mean, we had we didn't have the best first-party studio group.
No.
We had very good first-party group. It was small. There was a couple in Japan, which one was Polyphony, which became a monster company. Their first game was Moto Toon Grand Prix. It was like a little Mario Kart, 2D. We had, I would say, we were able to show the benefit of CD sound, which had been available, I think, in the 3DO or a couple of other systems, but so we could have real soundtrack, not just bleeps. And we had 2 or 3 tent poles that made it stand out. And one was Psygnosis Wipeout, which was fantastic. Another was a Psygnosis version of Formula One.
Mm-hmm.
We had good support from EA, but I would say the real drivers in the very first year or so were the Psygnosis titles, which included Destruction Derby.
Yeah.
And the Mickey's Wild Adventure, and Namco, Tekken. We didn't really have any big Japanese products. In Japan, they had Final Fantasy. And we did eventually do quite well with Final Fantasy, but that wasn't a console product, and it wasn't as well known at the time. And the next thing was that Ken Kutaragi and Phil Harrison, who was involved with us at the time, both recognized that we should be friends with developers and not enemies. Nintendo and Sega has always treated the third parties as a reluctant partner. Their own studios were always concerned.
Yeah.
Eventually, our own studios got a little bit concerned too, but they demanded minimum orders that were very high, pay up front. They were slow to slot the releases in of the third-party products. And we took the other approach, was to be friendly and welcoming and considerate of what we call third parties or licensees, including the big ones like EA and especially Ubisoft, the European one.
Mm-hmm.
There was some around the UK. And then, of course, Tomb Raider came along.
Yeah.
So eventually, we had a little crank of product scarcity or diversity. We didn't have at the very beginning, but by the second Christmas, which is 1996, we had the bases covered. Well, I think we were able to tap into the culture and the creative mindset and the user base of Europe that were used to products being developed in Europe, especially developed in UK, but some in France, Rayman, etc. And some in Germany. So we served the European market like a company that knew what they were doing in the European market.
Yeah. You felt like a European company. I always felt PlayStation felt like Europe. I think in America it felt like an American company.
Yes, yeah.
In Europe it felt like a European company. In Japan it felt like a Japanese company.
I don't think it was PS1, but the one thing I really am happy that we did was go for the Champions League signboards. And I think they're still doing it. I had experience with that marketing concept at Gillette, which was basically an American company, but doing 60% of its business overseas. And the U.S. people in Gillette said, "Why are you spending all that money with FIFA?" Because soccer, football was just not a big thing. But there's no better way to reach people, like the Heineken ad reaches the places others can't find.
Yeah.
Putting the name up, especially in the early days, was like a legitimizing factor. We were up there with Heineken and MasterChard. And you got so many like Sunday morning newspaper shots with a goal being scored and the PlayStation name behind. Serendipity happens. And I think that a combination of that and the relationship with the third-party developers or publishers and the distribution understanding and skill, and a lot of passion. And then in the UK, we did some crazy stuff with Geoff Glendenning, who'll be here later.
He'll come. He'll tell me about that. Yeah.
And Geoff was amazing, and I credited him and Ray Maguire in the early days of setting the setting the tone. And you talk about edgy. We were pretty edgy. We
Yeah, they were pushing the envelope.
Roach
But
clips
they did do some
and
things.
Glastonbury with a statement that said, "More powerful than God."
Yeah. I'll ask you one more question, and if you don't have an answer for it, that's fine. Is there something about the launch of PS1 or the thing of PS1 perhaps many people might not know?
Well, one of the big features we had was what we call IDUs, interactive display units. They had existed to some extent with Sega and Nintendo, but we really pushed that, and with Geoff Glendenning in particular, we put those into a lot of places.
Yeah.
And that was one of the other big, let's look like a real company. And we had those IDUs, or those display units, which it's trial units, in the store I was playing Richard Benson. And where we really put them in was like in the chill-out rooms of the rave clubs.
Yeah.
And that just got the word out. There was a very big underground aspect to launching the PlayStation, but it wasn't done on TV with edgy ads. It was done on the ground, shaking hands, buying drinks for the right people. It wasn't payola, but it was just reaching out. And we were very lucky to have the kind of people that liked doing that.
Yeah.
And were anxious to work 24/7 to do it. So it was a team effort, and we were very lucky to have the team we had. I hired some of them, but some of them just came along. The product was infectious.
Indeed. Well, thank you, Chris.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your stories.
No
and
problem.
enjoy the rest of your drinks.
I will. Thank you. Take care.
We have now Jim Ryan with us, the former president of PlayStation. Jim, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Chris. Who are you and what did you do on the start of the PlayStation?
So I'm now an aging retiree. I left Sony 18 months ago and I'm loving it. But I joined in 1994 in July, and it was, I guess, just a little more than a year before the launch of the first PlayStation. And my title was International Finance Officer.
Oh,
it's a magnificent title. I'm sure you'll agree. We had about 20 or 30 people in London, maybe a bit more, but really very little in continental Europe. And my job was to kind of build out the infrastructure in continental Europe. We had a handful of people in France, a couple in Germany, sister companies in some places, but my job was to form companies, find offices, dedicated PlayStation offices, hire more people, systems, processes. So it was
buying the furniture in Germany.
I've probably bored you with that story. So I mean, it was that sort of stuff, and it was like it's like a real startup, but without any equity at the time. So
was it IKEA you had to?
It was IKEA in Frankfurt, yes, and we did have serious discussion about whether we had enough money to have them come and assemble the desks, or whether we would have to do it ourselves. But happily, we came up with a few. I guess it was Deutschmarks at the time, and somebody was able to do it for us, because I'm not very good at that sort of stuff.
PlayStation was the new kids on the block, right? There were no one. What did you see when you came in as the biggest challenges or the biggest obstacles to making it work?
I think lack of experience, and because we had a few refugees from Sega and Nintendo, but a lot of people who'd never worked, like me, who'd never worked in the industry before, and kind of faced with this incredibly difficult challenge of bringing a new console, a new platform to the European market in just over a year. Yeah. And, Chris Deering, who you've met with, was amazing in terms of rallying everybody around and making a really kind of strong, coherent team out of us all. And it was great. I mean, that year was incredible. And one of the strange things was that, we sort of built up to the launch, and we spent a year, 15 months getting ready for the launch. And then huge sigh of relief and parties when we had the launch, but then a realization that we hadn't done anything yet, right? It was day one, and we had a zero install base, a nice launch and lots of events and all the rest of that. But the real work lay ahead of us, and we had 5 or 6 years of then going on to try and build something that was successful.
What did you think when you first saw it? So it was a secret project when you joined, and then you finally see the product. And
the hardware or the software?
Well, I guess the whole thing. I
mean, the software, I mean, obviously when you, Phil Harrison showed that, those Namco demos, Ridge Racer and Tekken, just amazing. You know, you've never seen anything quite like it before. And at that point thinking, this could be pretty good. This could be cool. Hardware came later, and I liked it, but you know, it was really the software that was most exciting.
It's, you know what I love the most is when we did an interview a few years, maybe it's about 5 years ago now, and I asked you what it was about PlayStation that's made it so successful. And I honestly, your answer was a very obvious one, but it didn't occur to me before. You said it was because it's cool. You said PlayStation is cool. And I guess it was from day one, it was kind of cool. Was that always the strategy? Or do you think it was sort of a natural combination of all the things?
I think it was a desire and an aspiration. Whether you would use the word strategy, I'm not sure. but certainly to make ourselves a bit different and to break out from the kind of, you know, position that video games had at the time have been something for children, or were perceived as being something for children. Yeah. I think we wanted, you know, there was the marketing, there was the whole Ministry of Sound thing, which, you know, obviously got a lot of traction in the media, and I think kind of taking the position of gaming from something that was perceived to be in the kind of 8 to 15-year-old and taking it to 15 to 25-year-old, I think that was a big part of our success.
What do you think it was about PlayStation, though, for Europe? Because it really dominated in Europe, and I know you ran Europe for a while. What was it about the brands or the games or the PS1 that really won over the continent in UK?
Maybe because we were new, but we paid attention to Europe in a way that I don't think any of the incumbents did at the time. Practical things like localization, you know, localizing games into European languages, Italian, Spanish, that often hadn't had it in any meaningful degree before. So I think that was a part of it. I think our marketing seemed to resonate. You know, a lot of the marketing that other people had done was simply an extrapolation of a global campaign, whereas our campaigns, as you know, were campaigns that were developed in Europe for a European audience. And I think Europeans appreciated that. We also had strong local presence. You know, these companies that I set up, other people built on, and built very, very strong local distribution presence in UK, France, UK obviously, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Benelux, you know, Austria, Switzerland, Ireland, the list, Scandinavia, the list goes on and on and on. And nobody else had that to that degree at the time.
It was obviously so big in Europe. It was a huge thing in Europe. But didn't you tell me once that Ken Kutaragi wasn't always impressed with what you were doing?
Well, yeah, he kind of struggled to understand some of it, I think. But at the end of the day, Ken is a very smart guy, and he just kind of look at the results and you know, realize what we were doing relative to other people at the time, and think, well, you know, I might not understand it, but
he found it inefficient, didn't he?
Yes, yes. But you know, the nature of Europe is that it's kind of different and a bit inefficient, and you've got to. And it was even more inefficient in 1995. You know, different currencies, different VAT. I mean, it was on and on, and the list went. It was tough then.
What do you think were the defining moments in those early days of PlayStation in terms of making the PS1 really become the console everyone had to own?
I think, you know, having a successful launch was obviously important. I would say that games like Tomb Raider and Resident Evil were really, you know, it's one thing to have a marketing aspiration to appeal to 15 to 25-year-olds. It's another thing to have real substance behind that. And I think games like that, which were massively successful, really kind of, you know, put some substance behind what we were trying to do.
Who are you and what did you do at the birth of the PS1?
I'm Juan Montes. I was the general manager, VP for development, internal development and third-party development. And
I was a producer, employee number 23, hired in 1994. I worked on everything from the first 7 years of PlayStation and ended up signing Guerrilla Games and Evolution Studios.
Oh, wow. So, and also just to couple of sentences, what were you doing before PlayStation?
Before PlayStation, I was new to the games industry. I was working in the database industry for a company that are competitors to Oracle. So I was a great learning, coming into the industry for me.
So I did a degree in biology and then got a job in Virgin Megastores, or actually Virgin Video Games, as a trainee manager. And then Phil Harrison was working at Mindscape at the time, and I did a promotion for Wing Commander 2, and he came down with, it was Richard Garriott actually was playing it in the store.
Oh, wow.
And I could tell Phil thought I'd done a good job, but at the time I thought, who is this guy and why would I work for him? And then 18 months later, I think he might have even less, he got hired as Director of Development for PlayStation, and I think he wasn't even 21. So I wrote him a letter and hand-delivered it to Soho Square, which is where their offices were, and he gave me a job. So I went from basically retail with no experience in development to the producer.
Wow. So let's go back to the start. PlayStation is, what did you make of what was your first experience of PlayStation? What was your first, the product?
I can tell you my first experience. So the first day I went in, Phil took us into his office, and there was a machine that looked like a fax machine, if you can remember what those are, kids.
Yeah.
And he showed us the PlayStation demos, which were very technical, but at the end, there's the famous dinosaur demo, which Jurassic Park had just come out at the time. So it was, I just remember thinking, this was absolutely mind-blowing. And I can't believe how lucky I am to be here, because I knew how revolutionary the machine was, even though at the time, Sony's reputation was like nothing. Yeah. And a lot of people in the industry were very dubious about us, particularly, when I joined, it was actually still technically SEPL, which just did a load of cartridge dross, and people at the time were very dismissive of our chances against Sega and Nintendo.
Yeah. But it was just a cool console, right? And the games were cool. It wasn't just the marketing that was cool. It wasn't just the positioning of the tool. The stuff that you were making and putting out and signing were cool. Was that deliberate, or was that just the culture?
I don't think you can underestimate the influence on the brand of Wipeout.
Yeah.
So it was a cool game, but don't forget, it was actually incredibly hard to play initially. It was not an accessible game. But the look of it, the graphical design, and the music, that fed a lot of what made the initial launch of PlayStation so cool. And if you look at some of the people you probably already talked to, like Geoff Glendenning, they really leaned into that. And that trying to position this as not a kid's machine, which is what Sega and Nintendo did, was strategic. But I think, it was organic. I don't think when we started out, they knew how they were going to position it. I think that just became, if we looked at a lot of the original products that made that product cool, they did actually come from Psygnosis.
Was there anything you didn't like about the PlayStation from a development point of view? Was there anything that you were like, oh, this was challenging?
Well, compared to Sega's machine, it was very, very easy to program. And I don't know about the Nintendo 64 because it came out so late. But, the thing about it was designed by engineers, right? So Nintendo is a toy company. I don't know what the background of Sega is. I guess it's coin up as well, isn't it? These people who designed PlayStation were hardware engineers. And there's a guy still working at probably Sony still now, Colin Hughes, who was a hardware engineer. And it's just a very clean, well-designed piece of hardware and software. So I don't remember any complaints.
And I think something which had important in the design philosophy at the time was trying to bring the experience of the arcades. 30 years ago, arcades, were everywhere. People used to spend time, playing arcades. So to have PlayStation 1, the technology, be able to bring arcade game like Ridge Racer, like Tekken, and be able to play at home, that was quite a big, part of the whole thing, which distinguished, compared to other platforms. So, yeah.
Okay.
And I just want to give you one anecdote because it's one of my favorites. So at the original PlayStation developer conference, Terry Takanaka, who at the time was the head of PlayStation, differentiated Sony from Nintendo and Sega by saying PlayStation is inexpensive, tasty, and locally available, like McDonald's. So if you imagine the cartridge costs of a Mega Drive and Nintendo are enormous, I think the turnaround time was something like 3 to 6 months. So if you had a success, it would take you 3 months to reorder it. And then, Sony was the first company to really embrace what they call global localization, which was every territory was responsible for marketing the product. And in Europe, I think Phil once said in most companies, Japanese companies, Europe was there be dragons, whereas we had individual territory heads working directly with retailers who were the lifeblood of the industry. And they made PlayStation cool because they told their customers that came into those stores, the sort of stores I used to go into when I was young, that this was the cool console.
What are your abiding memories from the launch of the PlayStation, particularly right back at the beginning? What are your abiding memories of those early days?
I think my defining memory is probably initially meeting and talking with some of the Japanese developers. Because initially we were relying on getting high quality games from Japan because the launch already happened there, and getting good conversions, for Europe. So meeting with companies like Namco, Capcom, and those type of companies, that was kind of a highlight. But in addition to the big companies and the big names, at the time we also met with lots of different smaller companies. They're trying to be very creative, diversify the portfolio. And some of the games we saw, they're kind of really different, some of them strange. Racing games, horse racing games, for example, fishing games. But it shows the variety of content, the variety of developers, looking at the platform and investing effort into the platform. That was probably my highlight on the kind of early days of PlayStation 1.
Yeah, I can't really add anything to that, but my over-abiding memory of Sony was great games and great parties.
It's always been.
We had, and it's legendary, and I don't think they've ever been topped, those first-generation PlayStation parties were legendary.
That's been the abiding answer to that question, bud.
Yeah, it really was. It was amazing.
I'll ask one more question. Can you tell us something about that period, of that time, that perhaps many people might not know about that PlayStation?
Well, I'm sure other people might have mentioned it. We had, Psygnosis were an established publisher. They weren't at Sony Computer Entertainment, so we had to build all our developer relationships from scratch, and we had no reputation. So the reason why in the end we ended up establishing relationships with completely new developers was because we had no other choice, and it was a real struggle at the beginning. And the one story I would share, which I think is one of the best kept secrets, is we almost bought Bullfrog, Peter Molyneux's company. One of the producers there was a friend of Peter's, and I remember sitting opposite him when he was having his phone call. And Peter pitched Dungeon Keeper, a game that never came out called The Invincibles, which was a superhero game, and another thing. And at the end of it, we decided that it was easier and cheaper to buy them. And that's how they ended up being bought by EA.
Oh, really?
I think something that probably not many people can know is internally within development studios, we were creating a football game at the time. The technology was there. It was pretty good. And we were very close, to getting the FIFA license. Very, very close. And at the end, we decided not to pursue it for, having a good relationship with a third party. But we were very close to being in that space.
That sums up PlayStation a bit, really, because you were seen as the friendly face for third parties, right? Nintendo and Sega they weren't the easiest to work with. They had a lot of restrictions. They had their big first-party studios that were really important. And PlayStation were always seen as looking after their partners.
I think that was down to a number of things. It was this global localization. So we had developer support in every territory. the Sega and Nintendo, you had to go to Japan.
Yeah.
And you had to have people who could speak Japanese. But whereas we had development support in every territory, also we didn't say no to things. You know, we had third-party approvals, but that was largely to do with maintaining standards in terms of packaging and making sure that the products could pass QA. But in terms of the actual content, we weren't restrictive.
Thank you so much. I'll let you get back to your drinks. You're Jackie Plumeridge.
Plumeridge.
Yeah.
And
you worked at Namco at the time. Yeah.
I worked for Namco, and I basically joined when my boss Kevin Yanagihara set up the European office in London, and I basically was involved with everything at the time with all the PlayStation titles.
Everybody we've spoken to has brought up like Ridge Racer and Tekken as being absolutely essential, crucial games in that era. What was it like working with PlayStation? Did you know you were dealing with something that was going to become such an iconic?
Yes, because when we first received the early versions of Ridge Racer and Air Combat and Tekken, which were sort of really amazing recreations of the arcade versions, we knew we had something quite special, and that it basically was going to sort of blow people away when it was sort of released on PlayStation 1.
PlayStation were the new kids on the block, though, right? They weren't Nintendo, they weren't Sega, they were new. I know that it wouldn't necessarily have been down to you to sign those partnerships, but what made PlayStation such a winner in the eyes of yourself and the company?
I think because it was quite easy to convert our arcade titles to PlayStation.
Yeah.
And I think we had a very close working relationship in Japan with Sony. So I think it sort of made it sort of quite a winning combination, I suppose.
What was your abiding memories of those times? Because, by the way, everyone keeps saying parties. That's the answer that we keep getting.
Well, I just think it was quite a fun time to be in the industry. When you saw the titles that were launched on PlayStation compared to the 16-bit consoles, it was such a big leap. So it was quite amazing to work in the industry, and also, quite a privilege to be part of it. And there were some amazing people that I worked with. So those are my memories, really, the people, the games. And it was just quite an exciting time to be in the industry.
So, I mean, I was talking to Chris Deering, was playing Tekken against Richard Branson in an event. And then you've got talks of people working through the night and getting at 6:30 in the morning, not because they had to, because they wanted to. It really felt like there was so much excitement around the brand and the launch. And what was it like for you working with PlayStation from the sort of outside of it?
We were lucky that we had such good titles for the launch, and we really enjoyed working with Sony and being part of the PlayStation launch, because I think Ridge Racer was sort of probably one of the lead launch titles.
So who did you work with directly? How did it work? Were you talk to
well,
us?
to be honest, I worked with all sorts of people. So sometimes we would have meetings with Chris Deering.
Yeah.
We'd also work with people like Doug Goodwin, Juan Montes. I worked with all the product managers. So people like Caroline Stokes, who sadly can't be here tonight.
Yeah.
I worked with Geoff Glendenning, who was amazing, his sort of energy and his passion for the games, but Caroline as well. And then I worked with some of the developers at Sony, some people on the development side. So a whole mix, really.
It was quite good that they had a lot of local. I know they had people, development teams and stuff all in every territory, right? So it wasn't like having to keep working with Japan, or perhaps it was like with other companies.
Sony Europe didn't get involved too much with Namco Japan development.
No.
A lot of it came through our office, so there wasn't a lot of direct communication. I think there was more between Sony Japan and Sony and Namco Japan.
The marketing around PlayStation, particularly in the early days, was quite edgy, I guess, quite risque. Was that something that worked for you, or was it something that Namco was comfortable with and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it worked very well in Europe, but it also took a lot of convincing for Namco Japan to realise that the market in Europe was quite different from Japan. So Namco was perhaps, a bit more conservative. So sometimes we had to tweak things that Sony presented to us because they weren't going to be suitable for head office. So there was sometimes there was a bit of compromise.
So tell us, who are you and what did you do at the launch of the first PlayStation?
So I'm Glen O'Connell, and I was the head of press at Psygnosis. So I launched Wipeout, Destruction Derby, and then the year later Formula One. So was involved obviously with a lot of the PlayStation European launch titles, and Psygnosis obviously was a part of the Sony group, although we did also work sort of autonomously to the overall Sony corporation.
And I'm Alan Welsman. I was head of PR for Sony Computer Entertainment, as it was then named. And I joined Sony in August 93, 2 years before PlayStation. So I ran all the PR for the PlayStation bit.
And where did you come before? Where were you before Psygnosis and PlayStation?
I'd worked for a company called Accolade, who were a games business for 2 years. And they were bought by Time Warner eventually. And they did things like Jack Nicklaus Golf, and they did a game called Test Drive. But it was kind of a hangover from the 80s, really.
Prior to Psygnosis, I worked for a small music company, and the job was giving out pre-release records to club DJs and radio DJs. And interestingly, some of the music artists I promoted ended up being on some of the soundtracks for Wipeout. So there was a nice sort of merging together of those worlds. And I think the music role was all about relationships. Obviously, that extended them when I joined Psygnosis.
Psygnosis was so central to PlayStation back then, like those games, that company in terms of establishing PlayStation as a credible console was so important. Did you realize that at the time, what the role that you played or the role that Psygnosis played in PlayStation?
Yeah, I think so. Psygnosis was acquired in 1993, primarily due to its sort of technical excellence. So it was one of the early pioneers in CD-ROM technology. And if you think before PlayStation, there was what was happening on PC, and then some somewhat niche consoles, the FM Towns coming out of Japan. So Psygnosis had heritage and technical expertise. But what it also had was a group of people, both at the studio side and development, and also in the marketing, who very much culturally, understood what was happening at the time. So the games that we launched were very different to the games that came out of Japan around the PlayStation 1 European launch. So amazing titles like Ridge Racer and what Namco did and other games. But we made games, I think, that very much fitted what was happening in the UK and Europe. And I think came at a time of just blending of gaming moving from the bedroom to the living room, about people who were interested in music and fashion and design, who were all of a sudden becoming games players. And I think the Psygnosis titles very much spoke to that, and we came at a time. I think we complemented very well what else was coming out of established game developers.
So, how did you find working with Psygnosis and the?
Well, they do. They definitely call the zeitgeist. It was kind of like post-rave, early 90s. That music, exactly as you've just described. Wipeout is the epitome of that coming together of all of those things. I kind of know Psygnosis more from the two founders, who then went on to be the joint managing directors of Sony for 2 years. So they kind of, if without Psygnosis, it would be very difficult to see how PlayStation would have understood the market for video games correctly, because Sony was a hardware business and Psygnosis and Jonathan and Ian, who ran it, were a software business.
So you were coming in, right? And PlayStation were the new kids on the block. Who is this PlayStation? There's Nintendo, Sega, we know who they are. But you came in and you won, we know what the story is. You won over Hearts, Richard, our producer, was at Games Master at the time, won over Game Master, you won over Edge, all these big victories that you had in PR. But before all that kicked off, what were your expectations? Do you feel that you were onto a winner, or were you just hoping to hold on?
Psygnosis were in an interesting position because we also looked after there's a company called SN Systems who did all the early development kits. So the very first PlayStation units we had were like, a big giant PC on a desk. It looked nothing like what the PlayStation became. So it was really just a development kit. So I think, technically, the people doing the development said, this is a really powerful piece of equipment. For whether we knew it would culturally, have that tipping point. And I think, if you look at the early marketing that came out of Sony, that Society Against PlayStation advert, really wasn't anything to do with what we were doing with the gaming and music. That was that really didn't fit the European markets so well. It was almost, this is being done and I'll take this as well. So I think in terms of whether the tipping point came, I think it just became a number of things that were happening culturally at the time. The people who were making the game, certainly at least from Psygnosis side, this is what they lived and breathed. These were people who listened to this music, wore the fashion, went to clubs, were interested in gaming, probably had grown up playing 16-bit consoles, but had this passion for making games for themselves and people like themselves. So I think that authenticity combined with Sony's coming into the market and just really disrupting the market and not just accepting what had come before as what the games business would become. But as to whether we knew it would become as big as it did, I look back and I think there was no real formula for us to the work we did. We were sort of allowed to make it up as we went along, really.
Well, the only thing, and again, to be fair to the games industry, which has obviously been going on for a long time before that happened, before PlayStation arrived, is that you had, so Sega in the UK had kind of started going into club culture and into the kind of underground, and they'd done all right, but as it happens in the industry, is the platform business went up and then went down. So Sega kind of fell back down with the Mega Drive, and then PlayStation came in, and it was the new kid on the block. So we had a chance to kind of renew that, reinvent it, as you say, but there was a bit of stuff had gone on before. Because don't forget, it's just a simple matter of demographics, which is the young kids who had played Nintendo when they were 10 were now 18 or 20, and so now they were playing games and still wanted to carry on, but wanted to be treated like adults when they were doing this. So that was kind of, I think, what we all did, is we reflected as they'd grown and changed.
What do you think were the defining moments or the defining characteristics about PlayStation that won over particularly Europe and the UK?
My take on that would be that, so first of all, don't forget it launched a year earlier in Japan. So you had the kind of tsunami that came over from there because it was majorly successful in the first place. And then I think, though, that we did go for that younger, we made it a lifestyle brand. We didn't go for a gaming brand. We tried to make it a brand. And again, if you'd have made it a Sony brand, it wouldn't have worked. PlayStation was distinct in its own right. And that meant that you could build that brand in a world that, exactly as Glenn say, a world of loving, just the culture that is going on at the time. So essentially that changed everything in the way we did that. The precursor to that was definitely the marketing guys at Sega who had done a bit of that, but we kind of took that on and made that a mass market thing.
I think both the work we did at Psygnosis and Sony, we took games to people who historically perhaps had not, and there might be interesting games, but they hadn't really been marketed to. But I think there was back to that authenticity. I think culturally at the time, what was happening in the country was being replicated by here is a games console that you don't have to hide away in the bedroom, because PlayStation 1 still looked like a toy. The color of it, everything else. So it didn't look like the high-end piece of equipment that came later on, but the games on it looked much more sophisticated. So if you think of the things that you listen to, the music, well, that was also appearing in the games you were playing, or later on some of the early sports games like Formula One, which we did. The commentary on that game very much was what you were listening to on television. So I think it just appealed to people's interest in general entertainment, and I think at the time, the media landscape at that time was, it seemed to reflect very well as to what was going on in the country. I definitely think from a UK point of view, all the work we did and Alan and his team and Sony did very much set the benchmark for Europe as well, because I think, Europe perhaps culturally wasn't the same as the UK, but people, whether it be France, Germany, Spain, Italy, were looking what was going on culturally in the UK. And I think some of that marketing then carried on into those countries.
I played Wipeout in the 90s, but I played it on the N64.
Yeah. Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
What the fuck is the Ghost doing
Well, there was an E3 incident as well. I think Psygnosis, whilst very much aligned alongside Sony, pretty much ran as an autonomous company, and I think that was down to the founders. So from Ian Hetherington and Jonathan Ellis, were very much, yes, we're now owned and acquired by Sony Corporation. And obviously they did the Sony Electronic Publishing sort of senior management roles, but loved the independent spirit. So Psygnosis as an independent spirit almost was allowed to carry on. So I think we carried on making games on other platforms. I think, the first two Wipeouts principally were on PlayStation, but, they appeared on the Sega Saturn. Obviously, then they appeared on the... And I don't think that was so much of an issue for Sony, but certainly at one of the E3s when it also appeared on Nintendo, it just arrived on the booth, and I think there was some faces who came and said, what's going on here? Because I think at that time, but that was probably the third year, so that was a couple of years after PS1 launch. Well, again, I think that was down to Psygnosis managed to retain an autonomy to make the games they wanted and put them on some other platforms. I think that was just down to the as I say, that independent spirit that the company had, really. Which was good and bad, because in some ways it, some of that work later on perhaps became why Psygnosis changed, and ultimately at the back end of the PS1 life cycle, the publishing side of Psygnosis pretty much disappeared. So I think there was lots of great at the beginning, but that maverick spirit perhaps also, created some challenges later on within the wider Sony group.
What were you? Let's go back to the PS1 launch though, and what would you say is your abiding memories of that time? What is your what do you when you think of that era? What do you remember, and how did you feel?
I mean, for me, it was being able to go and see games in places that you historically had never seen. So I remember giving a Japanese PlayStation to my local HMV store, and the people who would just come and just want to see what it was all about, who perhaps walked past games and never had an interest before. So all of a sudden, not just a games console, but also what was coming out of that console. The fact that it looked and sounded like something that was just, cinematic, but culturally was also fitting into what was going on in the country at the time. So to me, it's just being able to talk to people about working in the games business as well, and actually almost not apologizing for working in the games business to people. Being very proud of, here are things that, are being made for people like you and your friends. And I think that to me was, a really powerful, positive introduction, which obviously was built on by, many other games companies later on.
I think I've got a good line from what did happen was that gaming used to be regarded as a nerdy activity, and suddenly gaming became from a nerdy activity. So all the research that we were doing to it was regarded as nerdy. And then the issue became, no, it wasn't any longer nerdy. It became part of your cultural landscape. But what happened was that people then were very scared that they would play and they'd get addicted and they wouldn't be able to stop. So we had to kind of address that as well. But it just moved out of a ghetto of gaming into a cultural thing. And that was and again, I think, again, you have to kind of recognize our forebears there from Nintendo and Sega all through the years, Amiga, Atari, going back for years. And that made the difference. I think, in a way, it was all about the build up to that allowed us to then do the things that we enjoyed doing that hopefully made a difference in it.
Look, you both worked in public relations in the 90s in video games. Now, I know there'll be lots of stories you will not be able to put on camera on tape, but are there any stories, particular pinch me moments? Like, do you remember that time Richard Branson played Chris Deering in Tekken? Those sort of stories that you can share with us?
Yeah, I think if I remember what Psygnosis was doing, certainly some of the shock around the advertising and marketing that we were doing, it was really because it just sort of landed in the marketplace. And I think being able to take games into places that were almost quite dangerous and like perceived as, why are games in here? And I think whether that be nightclubs where it could be associated with, alcohol, drum taking, anything, but all of a sudden it was, the audience who are playing these games are people who also enjoy other things in their life as well. So I think, I look back and I'm pretty sure that, we were allowed to do a whole series of events and activities that corporately were probably not really being signed off, and maybe wouldn't be signed off today.
Definitely wouldn't.
But it was almost a thrill and the danger of taking gaming into places where it was we cared about what we were doing, but we also, because we lived and breathed it was like, well, this is a natural place for it to go. So I say, in particular, whether it be, I think there was a lot of sorts of frowns on why you're taking games into nightclubs in particular, and I think obviously Sony did an amazing job with that. We did similar things where we did club tours with DJs sponsored by Red Bull, music artists, and there were the connotations at the time of, nightclubs, evil, dangerous, drug taking, all the things that are going on, and we were inserting games into that place, with into quite a sort of dangerous sort of environment potentially. So that to me was something that, because we believed in what we were doing, and they were the places we went to anyway, that we didn't see the danger of that. We just thought, that's culture. That's what we're doing.
There was a year where we were in Los Angeles, staying at the Sunset Marquee. I'm a working class kid, staying in Sunset Marquee. First time I'd had tequila gold, and on the Columbia TriStar studio lot, and Phil Harrison, who I think you'll probably know, brought out a special guest to play on PlayStation at the PlayStation party at, wouldn't even have been E3 then, it was probably CES. And I can remember waking up in the morning and thinking, why the fuck did we get a Michael Jackson lookalike to come and play on PlayStation? And it was Michael Jackson. I love that. It was a great time.
Right, Alan Welsman is heading back to the party. Goodbye, Alan. Have fun. But Glenn, before you go, what was that relationship like between Psygnosis and Sony? It sounds like there might have been some friction there.
So, as I say, I think Psygnosis' acquisition with Sony, I think it was incredibly positive for Sony, but also there was friction. There was, there was that ability to stay that independence. And I think, Jonathan and Ian were very much, the pioneering spirit that Psygnosis had and built up. I think they very much wanted that to carry on, didn't want it to be sanitized by perhaps what might have come out corporately. So I think Jonathan and Ian assumed roles within the wider Sony electronic publishing group, but very much were having constant battles to make sure that the work that Psygnosis wanted to do could stay independent. And I think corporately they managed that very well. But there's probably a lot of stuff that went on behind the scenes where Psygnosis was almost shielded from a lot of the having to jump through various corporate hoops that were set very early on. And I think that allowed us probably to have that maverick spirit independence, which was matched by what some of Sony's own marketing did. But I also think it allowed us to do things, take risks that perhaps Sony wouldn't. And I think corporately, Ian and Jonathan very much, stood their ground. And I think, the games that Psygnosis did, ultimately the success it had, very much came down to them standing the ground and making sure, we will keep that independent spirit, even if they're part of the group.
Thank you, Glenn. I really appreciate it. It was lovely chatting to you. Who are you and what did you do with the first PlayStation?
Okay. I'm Geoff Glendenning. I joined Sony Electronic Publishing in 1984 when we were basically distributing third-party SNES and Mega Drive cartridges.
Where did you come from? Where were you before?
Well, my background is I'm a huge gamer, but also I worked in advertising.
Okay.
So when I came to PlayStation and I saw the PlayStation 1, the NTSC, saw Ridge Racer, Arcade Perfect, I just got an epiphany moment. I thought, we can't be launching to 10 to 14-year-old boys, which was the global positioning of PlayStation. Following very much the duopoly of Sega and Nintendo with their Mega Drive and SNES, the 16-bit. But with 32-bit, we'd gone Arcade Perfect and the ability to create real-time worlds that led into the likes of Tomb Raider and Metal Gear Solid and other such games that give you the freedom beyond arcades. And I thought, you know what, this isn't just for 10 to 14-year-old boys. I want to make games fucking cool. I was clubbing at the time. I was cynical about the over-reliance on mass media to create brands, which was having come from advertising, I knew that was bollocks. It was just a way of basically rinsing your clients to spend millions on TV to keep ramming the message home. The truth was, with the UK particularly, that we had the rise of club culture. The UK in the 90s was punching well above its weight culturally around the world. Music, fashion, everything, but from rave culture in the late 80s to club culture in the early 90s, there were more participants within club culture than if you put all of the other youth tribes of the 20th century together. So the mods, the hippies, and the romantics, the skinner. Every decade, youth culture changed. The music, the fashion. But when we hit the late 80s and 90s, it almost stopped there. And 30 years later, people are still looking back for inspiration to the 90s. So we had an amazing product. We had Namco to give all that amazing arcade heritage of Ridge Racer, Battle Arena to Shinden. Tekken was coming along. And then we had fucking Psygnosis. Wipeout obviously wasn't in the launch tiles, but the lineup was incredible. Even though there was a palpable concern that are Sega going to beat us because the Saturn came out literally 6 months before, and they had Virtual Racer. Sorry, they had Daytona, beg your pardon. Daytona and Virtual Fighter, and we had equivalent
Ridge Racer and
arcades.
Tekken,
Yeah. And they had 6 months jump, but they went down a very corporate route. Now, during the whole of 1995, we had the NTSC version to demonstrate. So my job in the 1995 as marketing manager was on the back of a document I wrote called Credibility for PlayStation, which was we need to launch to an 18 to 30-year-old market as a brand and be edgy and cool. And with that positioning, you will achieve a 6 to 60 sales range from the little kids who want to be their big brothers, from the reflection of society in the UK, which changed where cultural influences were crossing over multiple generations.
Yeah. Tell us about some of the things that you did, because I know there's lots of them.
So in 1995, I identified basically who were the key movers and shakers within youth culture. And if you talk about Star Press magazines, like in those days, there was like ID, Face, Loaded hadn't launched, Dazed and Confused hadn't launched. But above those, if you think about a pyramid of influence, there were really obscure underground magazines that came out occasionally. And they only had readerships of maybe 5 or 10,000. But that readership were the most influential people within culture. They were the editors, the DJs, they were people, And that influence of culture flows down from the opinion forms influencers down to the early adopters into what would be not the mainstream, but the credible mass market. So I'd get people into the office continuously, and I'd say, do you like video games? They go, no. I said, okay, check this out. Knowing full well and they're all blown away, and we give them free kit. And they start going, well, this is amazing. Can I get some slides? Because I'd like to do a spread just on the graphics. We didn't pay for any endorsement. We had a culturally connected team in-house. The fact that we had mates who were DJs and we were in that culture, and Pippa Day, particularly who I hired from the music industry, was my wing woman. We basically connected with people, built relationships that said, how can we work with you and support you? Not just stick your logo here like a corporation, but simply looking to support culture, not hijack it. So, as I said, I don't like football, I don't like Formula One, so we built a skate park. We have 52 nightclubs with PlayStation rooms in, 500 nightclubs with visuals playing. We did skateboarding, snowboarding, surfing, downhill mountain biking, BMX, snakeboarding, breakdancing, graffiti. I mean, we were absolutely, and fashion, absolutely everywhere that, as far as we were concerned, was culturally influential, that would trickle down to the mainstream.
You must have run into some opposition from Japan, or did you just sort of ignore all that?
We had Chris Deering, El Presidente, as a reflection of the respect he had within the Sony Corporation, that Europe was autonomous to America, which is not the same now, and Japan to a certain degree. And of course, back then, Sony Computer Entertainment Europe was everything that wasn't North America and Japan. And within that startup environment in the UK, having written that document to position PlayStation older, I was pretty much allowed to get on with it. And I didn't give a fuck. I was on a mission to change the world, not just to make games cool, but also demonstrate that brands aren't built by spending millions on traditional mass media advertising, but by creating word of mouth in the underground.
You must have got in a little trouble every now and again, surely.
Yeah. There are certain things that are talked about and still talked about. And one of those is probably, I would say, the perforated cards that we distributed outside nightclubs. Because back in the day, I was with, I grew up in a very creative circle of people who were in music and fashion and art. And it's totally natural for us, fucking ADHDers, to gravitate towards interesting people. And the drugs of choice were very much just getting stoned. It's a creative drug. So for me, I knew that people go out clubbing and, class A's aside, they go home and have a smoke, they go, and you're always tearing up your Rizzler packets. So I thought, well, let's do a perforated flyer with 40 roaches on each card and have them distributed outside nightclubs. I did 1.2 million, and the flyer company phoned up and said that was the most successful flyer we've ever given out. We had people taking one, going away, coming back and grabbing handfuls to give to all their mates. And that was a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek nod that Sony was a bit unconventional. There were people at Sony that were connected, and it was a bit of fun. So
I'll ask one more question. What was your abiding memory of that time? What were your, how did you, particularly the launch of the PlayStation right at the start?
I think perhaps that, talking to Doug Goodwin, the director of sales, and I asked him to clarify the situation in Dixon's. And he gave me a great anecdote, but Dixon's in those days, everything was high street retail, and the retail buyers would say how much you're spending on advertising. And that's almost like the symbiotic relationships between retail and hemorrhaging shit tons on mass media. And Doug said that he had this meeting with the owner of Dixon's, who was being insanely arrogant about the margin, which Sony just couldn't deliver. And Dixon's felt that if you're a consumer electronics product, without Dixon's you would have failed. So going into Christmas 1995, we didn't have distribution with Dixon's. But all the Dixon's allocation went very quickly to everybody else. So I think the overriding feeling going into Christmas when we launched on in September was that there was a palpable fear of failure. But I didn't ever have that sense of failure because we've been working in the underground, all year with the NTSCs and beyond. And the word of mouth, everybody was talking about PlayStation. The most culturally connected people within the UK culture were talking about PlayStations. They were our mates. They were phoning up going, you can't believe we just had a meeting with these guys from this. They were talking about PlayStation. So I was under no illusion that we were going to crush Sega. And by April 1996, where we had that kind of mic drop moment of 199, whatever, and Sega, we outsold them 8-1. And Sega from there started to be delisted. So yeah, I think that was my overriding memory.
Thank you.
What I do?
Yeah, that will do very well. You hit all the beats. That's it for today's episode of the Game Business Show. I hope you enjoyed our trip down memory lane. If you enjoyed these interviews, we do have an extended version of this podcast available for you to download at thegamebusiness.com. But you have to be a paid subscriber to get that. We'll be back with more news, analysis and interviews into the video game industry in the days and weeks to come. Until next time, thank you for tuning in.